Well, as luck would have it, we are talking about the social construction of reality via Screencast. That is not the best way or the way that I had anticipated doing it, but I think it'll give us a chance to really dive into some of the key quotes and look at some of the questions that I'm posing for you guys and start to see how we might construct our idea about globalization and curriculum using this idea of the social construction of reality as a framework for that. We started last week in class just a little bit by looking at some of the beginning quotes that I'd highlighted, and I wanted to revisit those again in the screencast. Remember that you have access to all of these slides through our course site website. You can just download them easily from there if you'd like to follow along at home. And of course, I will be showing them on here. I'd like to ask that you watch all of these little about 15-minute screencasts. There'll be several of them strung together. And you will see a discussion board specifically dedicated to a discussion about the social construction of reality and what that means for globalization and curriculum for our CIE class. You'll see that discussion board in course site, and I would love for you to engage in this conversation by posting a comment or a question or responding perhaps to some of your colleagues. Since we aren't able to meet in person today or next week, and we'll do some screencasts for that as well, your participation in the discussion board after you watch these screencasts and of course do the required readings, but that participation in the discussion board is really the only way that I know you are engaging this material. So please don't skip that. Be active. Be a part of the conversation. It won't take you really any longer than it would to participate in the face-to-face class. So if anything, this is a more flexible way of doing it, not really a way to skip it. Okay. So having given you my little let's stick with it talk, let's talk a little bit more about the social construction of reality, a treatise in the sociology of knowledge by Berger and Luckman. The book is broken down into several different sections. I'm going to jump right into the second section, Society as Objective Reality. In the first section, Berger and Luckman spend quite a bit of time sort of outlining why this is an important topic and what we might want to think about related to it. That is certainly something that we can discuss, although I would like to dive right into one of the two final big points. So society is an objective reality, and then the next section after this will be society as a subjective reality. Those are both important to consider, and let me just abstractly talk about that for a second. We want to talk about objective and subjective reality because it helps us think about what we're actually putting into our brains and recognizing as real or not real. I used the example in class last week that an objective reality is something that is in many ways real, regardless of whether or not we believe it is real or we recognize it as real. Right? So the reality is that I am sitting in a room on a chair made of wood, that I am talking into a computer. I mean, these are all things that can be empirically observed and verified. Subjective reality can be very real to individuals or groups or, quite frankly, whole communities without necessarily being empirically verifiable. And so we have a key distinction as we move forward, and this is important for us because as we think about how this relates to curriculum, curriculum is a way of stating what is valued and real information or knowledge. It is the content of what we do in schools or in training workshops or in other sorts of educational settings. It's the content. And it can create both objective and subjective realities. Objectively, there are things that happen historically, right? Or there is the truth that, let's say, 2 + 2 = 4. Right? There are some things that we can objectively verify. Whether we believe it's true or not, we can objectively and empirically verify it. However, the way that, and history is an easy one to pick on, so I'll do that. The way that, for example, history curriculum might be developed could put a particular spin on the events. still reporting perhaps the same objective reality, but in a way that makes it seem somehow more real to believe one interpretation of those events than another interpretation. And I'll use an example a little later on. Right? So there's our basic objective versus subjective reality discussion. Now, I started out with a quote from page 47 that we talked about this briefly in class. And I have as the heading institutionalization, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But first, let's look at the quotes. On page 47, despite an area of individual learning and accumulation, the individual dog or the individual horse has a largely fixed relationship to its environment. So this idea of a fixed relationship versus a flexible one is going to be important. So, dog or horse has a largely fixed relationship to its environment, which it shares with all other members of its respective species. In this sense, all non-human animals as species and as individuals live in closed worlds whose structures are predetermined by the biological equipment of the several animal species. All right, the argument is that non-human animals have a fixed relationship to their environment. They don't necessarily create different realities or different relationships with their environment. They pretty much do what they do. Right? So this idea of a closed world whose structures are predetermined, let's just look at that part. So a closed world where structures are predetermined is a very fixed environment. It means that there is no alternative to the way that these animals, these non-human animals in this example, interact with their environment or relate to their environment. Now, what is the environment? Well, the environment can be many things. It can be the area in which we live. It can be the context in which we live. It can be the organizations and institutions through which we live or within which we live. So we could say that there is a school environment, a home environment, a family environment, a community environment, a national environment, a global environment, right? I mean, it goes all different ways. But the idea is what is fixed and what is flexible. Berger and Lechman go on to say, by contrast, man's relationship to his environment is characterized by world openness. Not only has man succeeded, I should underline that, by the way, in contrast to the closed world, not only has man succeeded in establishing himself over the greater part of the Earth's surface, his relationship to the surrounding environment is everywhere very imperfectly structured by his own biological constitution. Okay, so first of all, the diversity with which humans, that's what they mean when they say man, so the diversity of human, I'm just going to say DIV for diversity, of humans allows for a much more world openness. Now, what does that mean? In this example, Berger and Lechman are saying the relationship to the surrounding environment is, in this case, structured by the human's biological constitution, not by predetermined structures. Okay, there's an important distinction there. So in a fixed world, the predetermined structures that are out there in the environment determine how the, in this case, non-human animals interact with that environment. By contrast, the surrounding environment is structured by man's constitution, by humans, rather than by the environment alone. In other words, humans have the ability or the option or the capacity to actually imprint on or restructure or manipulate their environment. Whereas from a non-human animal perspective, Berger and Lechman are making the argument that animals are structured by their environment, whereas humans themselves structure the environment. All right. Now we know that if you've taken a zoology class or you've watched National Geographic on TV, we know that animals do interact with their environment. And we know that there are some animals that can manipulate it more than others. However, humans manipulate their environments in ways that are far beyond anything non-human animals can achieve. And that is what creates this world openness. The world is really subject to humans' will or humans' activity, much more so than humans are subject to their environment or their world. All right, so we have that. And that gets us to a little bit more of a statement about how to construct human nature. So on page 49, humanness is socio-culturally variable. In other words, there is no human nature in the sense of a biologically fixed substratum determining the variability of socio-cultural formations. Well, let's just start with the big one, culturally variable. There is only human nature in the sense of anthropological constants, for example, world openness and plasticity of instinctual structure, that delimit and permit man's socio-cultural formations. All right? But the specific shape into which this humanness is molded is determined by those socio-cultural formations and is relative to their numerous variations. Let's circle that so that we remember to come back. While it is possible to say that man has a nature, it is more significant to say that man constructs his own nature, or more simply, that man produces himself. And then the million-dollar question is, what does this mean? Okay, socio-culturally variable. Back up here. Right? So we have the idea of society, we have the idea of culture, and we have the idea of variability. This is simply saying that human nature or humanness varies across the world in terms of society and culture. Right? So there are different societies with different cultures all over the world. Now, the question is, why is that? And remember that just a few pages ago, Berger and Lechman were contrasting this with animals. Could we say in the same sense that animals are socio-culturally variable? Well, perhaps, but it would be in a much more limited sense. We're not going to find that, horse society is so much different in Mongolia than it is in Utah, right? So they go on to say the specific shape into which this humanness is molded is determined by those socio-cultural formations and is relative to their numerous variations. So what makes us human? What we consider essentials of human nature or core characteristics of human nature are going to be determined by sociocultural formations that vary, as we just said up here, all over the world, and that humanness will then be relative to those variations. In other words, it will change based on where you are and what the variations is, or how humans are adapting to and determining their environment. All right? While it is possible to say that man has a nature, in other words, that there's just some sort of fixed nature, it is more significant to say that man constructs his own nature. Right? So now we have fixed versus flexible, or more simply, that man produces himself. Man produces himself. So the question is, how? Now, in our class dealing with globalization and curriculum, I think an easy answer for us is to say, well, one way is by determining what knowledge is real and valued. And the way that we do that increasingly worldwide is through formal mass education and the curriculum that determines the content, the knowledge, the information that is valued in a particular community. Right? So we use that sort of structure. We create the curriculum. We create the value that goes with that. And then we structure our environment, in particular our school environment, around that, so that we can construct human nature using curriculum. Pretty cool start. Maybe a pretty scary start, depending on what your perspective is on that. All right. Now I will pause here and come back in another screencast to continue.